Happy Friday, everybody. James Hancock here, back to review a new movie that was completely, totally off my radar, but I'm happy to report that Puppet Master: The Littlest Reich is one of the most wildly entertaining horror movies that I expect to see all year. Right now, the movie is playing theatrically in limited release, but in their infinite wisdom, they also decided to release it on a few digital platforms. I caught it on Vudu. I'm not quite sure how many more platforms you might be able to find it on, but if you're a horror fan, even if you've never seen a single movie in the Puppet Master franchise, I strongly encourage that you check this out. The franchise has been around since 1989, and there have been more than 10 of them at this point. I should have been a big fan back in the day because I was 13 when the first movie came out. I was a giant horror fanatic. I had a subscription to Fangoria magazine, who, by the way, is one of the presenters of this particular movie. But for whatever reason, the movie just wasn't on my radar. I barely remembered it from back then. I managed to catch a few scenes here and there. I saw the original film for the first time yesterday, just as a little bit of preparation. But after seeing people talk about the movie on Twitter, I realized that this movie was written by S. Craig Zahler, a filmmaker that I just started getting familiar with recently. But I was preparing for an episode of my podcast, Wrong Reel, where we were tackling his two films that he directed, Bone Tomahawk and Brawl in Cell Block 99, two movies that I absolutely loved, and my podcast about those two movies will be up in a couple days. And much of what I liked about those two movies absolutely holds true for Puppet Master: The Littlest Reich. They are unpretentious genre films. They feature horrific, brutal violence. In the case of Puppet Master, abundant nudity as well. But most importantly, there's not an ounce of preachiness in any of these movies. I feel like we live in an era where a lot of filmmakers feel like every frame of their films, every line of dialogue, somehow needs to be an extension of their personal politics or their political activism. But S. Craig Zahler seems to completely reject that filmmaking philosophy. He makes these lean, mean, pure genre films that feel like they come from a different era entirely. So much of Puppet Master will feel like it comes from a bygone era. I mean, Fangoria was one of the king brands of the 1980s when it came to horror. That alone lets you know where this movie is coming from. But it features actress Barbara Crampton, who obviously starred in Reanimator, one of the best horror films of the 80s. Some of the music is by Fabio Frizzi, and Fabio Frizzi did some of the all-time best horror scores ever for Lucio Fulci. You can find his music in movies like The Psychic and Zombie. So I went into watching this movie curious but slightly skeptical, but I have to say I was absolutely delightfully surprised from start to finish. I found myself caring for the characters far more than I would have expected. There's a love story at the heart of this that is so sweet and so moving. It might be one of the best love stories I've ever seen in any horror film. But I love how the movie's a tight, economical 90 minutes. And I guess at this point it'd probably be helpful if I actually did say what the movie's about. And I should say in advance that this movie is obscenely, grotesquely violent, so much so that you'll find yourself cracking up because that's the only rational reaction to violence that is this over the top. But if you are at all squeamish about over the top violence, now is the time to depart from this video. But this movie picks up 30 years after this horrific massacre in 1989, where this Nazi in hiding, André Toulon, he was mowed down by the police because they discovered that he was actually building these insanely demonic magical puppets that would go around committing mass murder as an extension of his Nazi philosophy. They focused on Jews and gypsies and homosexuals, basically any non-Aryans, and now his mansion where he constructed all these puppets, it's been converted into a giant museum, and there's this upcoming convention where everybody who's interested in the history of André Toulon, they're coming to the convention as part of this giant auction in order to sell the remaining puppets that are still in circulation. And at the center of the story is a struggling comic book illustrator who also works in a comic shop. His name's Edgar, he's played by Thomas Lennon. His brother mysteriously died years ago, but he did have in his possession one of these puppets that the die-hard aficionados of this franchise will recognize as Blade. And so he decides to attend the convention with his boss, Markowitz, as well as Edgar's insanely cool new girlfriend, Ashley. And I absolutely fell head over heels in love with Ashley from the word go. When she first hears about this convention in a very mocking tone, she says, "Don't you realize that this is something that exemplifies everything wrong with our society?" And then the three of them just start cracking up because these are three people that absolutely have nothing but total disdain for, as they describe them, hipster douchebags, people who take themselves too seriously. And I imagine because this movie does at times ridicule people that might be described as SJWs or whatever terminology you want to use, that there'll be some people who automatically criticize this movie as coming from some extremist alt-right point of view. And nothing could be further from the case, because the villain of the story is someone who totally believes in the Nazi philosophy. And a lot of this movie is focused on Markowitz, who is a Jew, getting some much-deserved payback for what his ancestors suffered at the hands of the Nazis. So much of this movie reminded me why I fell in love with horror movies back in the 80s in the first place. And the nudity in this movie is a big part of that. In the 80s when I was a kid, whether those action movies or comedies or horror, there was nudity all over the place. But in 2018, you're much more likely to see abundant nudity on TV, whereas in movies, it's very buttoned up and they avoid nudity at all costs. And it's not just the fact that there's nudity, it is gratuitous gratuitous nudity. There's one scene where Blade is attacking a couple, and as he moves in for the kill, the camera very lovingly and longingly pans up the body of this astonishingly hot girl before Blade moves in for the kill. It's something that you see very rarely in film and television today. But what was pretty unusual about this movie is that most of the characters you actually kind of like. I feel like a lot of horror movies back in the 80s, the characters are just pure cannon fodder, and you're kind of eagerly waiting to see something horrible that might befall them. Almost like they were so stupid, they kind of had it coming. But you'll find yourself rooting for a bunch of the characters in this movie, and it subverts expectations. Basically, the night before the convention, all hell breaks loose because suddenly you have a couple of dozen of these dolls all under one roof in this hotel. And when the dolls go on their rampage, initially they're just focusing on the people that will be the natural targets for this Nazi philosophy. But when the people start fighting back, everybody's fair game. And a scene that perfectly captures that is there's this large black dude who works in the bar there. He's a bartender, and he's trying to protect this small white kid, and he's basically saying, stand behind me, I'll protect you. And wherever they go, he's kind of acting as a shield, but he comes through a door and he turns around and he just sees these two little white hands that have been severed that are still clinging to his shirt. Once upon a time in horror, those roles would have been reversed. I'm sure there are a lot of fans out there who know all these puppets on a first name basis. I picked up a few of them here and there, like Pinhead. Pinhead I remember actually from the 1989 movie. But I feel like whichever puppets you're a big fan of, they all get their hero moment where they do something particularly gruesome. For me, the most gruesome kill is probably when this one guy's taking a leak, and as he's looking down and you see a shot of his penis as he's peeing, he gets beheaded and the head tumbles down into the toilet where he continues to pee on it for a few seconds before the body falls over. And there are plenty of shots of people getting their arms ripped off or getting disemboweled. There's one really nasty one. There's a baby Hitler, and what he does, he crawls inside of a guy's back and actually starts operating the guy like a human puppet. And in one of the most satisfying moments of the movie, Markowitz grabs the baby Hitler and says, let's see how you like it, and throws him in an oven. But my biggest surprise of the movie by far, and this is heavy spoiler territory, so if you don't want spoilers, stop now, last warning, but I was genuinely surprised by how sad and moved I was by the finale. Edgar and Ashley drive to Andre Toulon's resting place. He basically is in this tomb with all these lightning rods that are providing power to the puppets, and they drive their pickup truck into it, interrupting the flow of life to all the puppets. Toulon rises from the grave and he's this giant, horrible monster, and he ends up shooting Ashley before walking off into the woods, and it absolutely broke my heart. And the movie ends with this perfect cliffhanger where Edgar has turned his entire experience into a new comic. If you're a fan of comics, there's some really cool details in this movie. The opening credits is just an extended hand-drawn illustration sequence basically summing up all the lore of the Puppet Master universe. I'm a lifelong reader of comics, and it was just absolutely stunningly beautiful. But we see that Edgar has converted his love of this woman into his character Madame Lightning. And the movie ends very ominously, just saying to be continued over him. And I don't know if they could get S. Craig Zahler back. I don't know if they could get Fabio Frizzi back. But if they can get some of the creative people on this movie back, I would be 100% down for watching the sequel. I don't know much about the directors Sonny Laguna and Tommy Wickland, but both these filmmakers now are going to officially be on my radar in the years to come. I'm looking on IMDb right now, and they're apparently working on a movie called Old Shadows, so who knows? Maybe Old Shadows will contain some of the same horrific delights the Puppet Master, The Littlest Reich, contained. So I think that's about all I have to say on this particular movie, but if you're a true horror fan who absolutely delights in seeing really graphic, fun horror movies go to the absolute extremes of the genre, this movie is absolutely for you. And speaking of S. Craig Zahler, he has a new movie called Dragged Across Concrete that he wrote and directed that I think is about to come out in festivals that we can look forward to seeing in the very near future. So I'm intensely fired up to see what that movie is all about. But I hope you enjoyed my reaction and review. If you did, please consider subscribing to my channel. If you want to talk more, hunt me down on Twitter @Colbrax or leave a comment in the comments below. But as always, I really appreciate the support for my channel. Onwards and upwards.